The dawn was heavy with fog. The river lay still, a silvery ribbon that cut through the gray morning, reflecting clouds that hung low and ominous. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Every step along the muddy bank sank slightly, leaving a trail that vanished almost immediately into the mist. Silence pressed against him from every direction, except for a faint, fragile sound that pricked his ears. He walked slowly, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. Thomas had been wandering these paths for as long as he could remember. Not tonight, he had just arrived, but in his mind the river had always been a place to think, to disappear. His face was pale, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, traces of a man haunted by mistakes he could not undo. The faint sound came again, a soft, whimpering cry that seemed impossibly small against the vast emptiness of the riverbank. Thomas froze. His heart thumped painfully against his chest. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, the fog playing tricks on him. But no. The sound came again, closer now, trembling, unmistakable. A child. He moved cautiously, each step uncertain, drawn forward by a mixture of fear and curiosity. And then he saw it, a small figure curled into itself, sitting on the edge of the water. The child's clothes were soaked through, hair plastered to the forehead, and little arms wrapped around knees trembling with cold. The river lapped gently at the shore, oblivious to the fragile life beside it. Thomas? The voice was small but clear, fragile yet haunting. The name froze him in place, turned his stomach to ice. Thomas's mind spun. Oh. Oh. The words hung in the air, echoing against the silence of the fog. The child's eyes lifted to meet his, wide and steady, brimming with tears that refused to fall. He felt his breath catch. This was impossible. He couldn't, spoken to anyone who knew his name here. And yet, the sound of it coming from the mouth of a drenched, trembling child rooted him to the spot. Every memory he had tried to bury clawed its way back to the surface. The nights of despair, the loss, the guilt that had become a part of him. The child's voice was a key, unlocking doors he had hoped would remain closed forever. Thomas's legs moved on their own. He stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to reach out or run. Fear twisted with longing inside him. The child did not flinch or cry out again, only looked at him with that strange, knowing gaze. There was something familiar in the way the little face held him, something that tugged at the edges of memory like a half-forgotten dream. He bent slightly, careful not to scare the child. The fog swirled around them both, thickening the space between reality and uncertainty. His mind raced, questions colliding with disbelief. Who are you? How do you know my name? He wanted to speak, to reach for the child, but his voice refused to cooperate. The silence stretched, oppressive and tense. The river moved lazily, indifferent, as if mocking the fragile humanity on its edge. Thomas's heart pounded, not from fear of the water, but from the impossible truth before him. This child, this small, drenched, shivering creature, had called him by name. And somehow he knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The fog seemed to pulse, the world around him blurred, leaving only the child's face, pale and soaked, staring straight into him. Thomas swallowed hard. The weight of his past pressed down on his shoulders as though the mist itself were alive with memory. He took another step forward, drawn irresistibly toward the child, even though every instinct screamed caution. In that moment, the river, the fog, and the fragile cry became more than a scene. They became a question. A challenge. A summons. Thomas felt something in him shift, a mixture of fear, hope, and dread swirling together. He had no idea what this encounter would bring. But one thing was certain. The moment the child had spoken his name, the course of his life had changed forever. And somewhere deep in his chest, a spark of recognition, a whisper of something lost long ago, took hold. Thomas's hands trembled as he bent closer, the fog swirling around him like a living thing. The child sat still, knees drawn to chest, shivering in the cold, wet morning. Every instinct told Thomas to be cautious, to keep his distance, but every heartbeat pulled him closer. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. The child tilted its head, eyes wide and unwavering. "Thomas." The single word fell into the silence like a stone, heavy and impossible. Shock froze him. His mind raced, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be real. He had no children. No siblings missing. No one who could possibly know him well enough to speak his name here, at this deserted riverbank. And yet, the familiarity in the child's gaze was undeniable. Thomas swallowed, forcing his knees to bend as he lowered himself closer. Who are you?" The child's lips quivered. "I've been waiting for you." The words made his stomach lurch. Waiting for him? How could this tiny drenched figure have been waiting for him? Every fiber of his being told him to run, to step back into the fog and forget this impossible encounter. But he couldn't. The pull was too strong, the sense of connection too real to ignore. He glanced at the child more closely. Dirty blonde hair stuck to a pale forehead, tiny fingers wrapped tightly around damp knees. The clothes were ragged and wet, sticking to the small frame. Yet, in the child's eyes, there was a strange calm, a quiet understanding, as if they were holding knowledge he had long buried. Thomas's mind flickered. Memories long suppressed began to surface. He saw his own childhood home, the way the sunlight fell across the floorboards, the sound of his mother's laughter. And then flashes of loss. A sister who had vanished one summer, the guilt he had carried for years, thinking it might have been his fault, some vague, irrational responsibility he could never shake. "Thomas?" The child's voice brought him back, sharp and present. He froze. The way the little mouth shaped his name, the precise tone, made his heart twist. There was something about the familiarity that was more than coincidence. It was personal, intimate. He had known someone like this before, someone small, fragile, and dependent on him. Yet the years had passed, and the memory had faded. Did you know me?" he whispered, fear and hope fighting for dominance in his chest. The child nodded slowly. "I remember." Thomas's chest tightened. He wanted to ask what, to demand answers, to shake them and make sense of this impossible reality. But the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he studied the child's face, looking for signs of recognition, for clues. And slowly, pieces of his memory began to line up, like stars forming a constellation long hidden behind clouds. He remembered the summer by the old oak tree, the way laughter had once filled the air, the sound of a small voice calling to him in innocence. He remembered loss, confusion, a hole in his heart that never fully healed. And now here this child, the impossible child, was calling his name, connecting him to a past he thought was gone forever. He crouched closer, careful to move slowly, not to frighten. Why are you here?" The child's gaze held his, steady and unwavering. "I needed you." Those words tore through him. The depth of them, the vulnerability, the raw honesty made Thomas's eyes sting. He knelt fully now, mud soaking through his jeans, hands reaching tentatively, unsure whether to touch or simply stay near. Every part of him wanted to protect this fragile figure, to scoop them up and shelter them from the world. And yet, disbelief gnawed at the edges of his mind. Am I dreaming? Am I losing my mind? The child's presence seemed too precise, too perfect, too impossible. But every instinct, every emotional cell in his body screamed that this was real. Slowly, he extended a hand, hovering above the child's shoulder. The small hand did not flinch, did not retreat. Instead, it lifted slightly, brushing against his fingertips, warm and trembling. The touch sent a shock of recognition through him, a feeling of long-lost familiarity that was almost unbearable. Thomas's vision blurred. Memories came unbidden. Bedtime stories, quiet nights spent in gentle conversation, the sound of laughter echoing across rooms that no longer existed. He remembered moments of joy and moments of grief, fragments of a life interrupted, fragments that now seemed to be reflected in this child's eyes. Where did you come from?" he asked, voice breaking. The child shrugged, a tiny gesture that carried weight far beyond its size. "I've always been here. Waiting." Thomas swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to dissipate. Every logical explanation failed, and still the truth pressed itself against him. This child was connected to him in ways he could not fully understand. The connection was not just emotional, it was spiritual, deep, undeniable. He stood slowly, unsure what to do next. The child followed his movement with wide, trusting eyes. Thomas's gaze wandered to the misty river, the gray sky above, and the silent trees lining the bank. He knew he could not leave. Not now. Not after this impossible, aching pull toward something he had lost long ago. He took a tentative step forward. "Come with me," he said gently. "Let's get you out of the cold." The child nodded, sliding to their feet. Wet clothes clung to the small body, but there was no hesitation. Something in the air shifted, a delicate thread of trust woven between them. Thomas felt a flicker of hope, fragile and trembling, yet undeniable. As they moved away from the riverbank, Thomas glanced back once into the fog. The water flowed silently, indifferent, carrying with it the weight of memories and questions. The child walked beside him, small hand brushing against his, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt a glimmer of purpose, a spark of something he had thought lost forever. The river, the fog, the cold, all of it receded into the background as the weight of connection pressed forward. He did not know what mysteries awaited them or what truths the child held. But he knew one thing: he could not turn away. Not now. The journey had begun. The walk from the riverbank to Thomas's small apartment had been quiet, the child's presence beside him a weight he couldn't define. Each step was heavy, carrying the tension of the impossible. Thomas kept glancing at the child, so small, so fragile, yet somehow knowing. It was as if the child carried pieces of his own life that he had tried desperately to forget. Once inside, he led the child to the couch and wrapped a blanket around the wet shoulders. The warmth was immediate, but the child didn't move. Instead, eyes wide, fixed on him as if reading every unspoken thought. Thomas sank into a chair across from them, rubbing his face, trying to steady the storm of memories inside him. The first memory hit him without warning. A summer afternoon, sun streaming through the windows of his childhood home. He was 8, sitting on the floor with a small sibling, a little girl with laughing eyes, building towers from blocks. Their mother's voice echoed from the kitchen, calling them to ice cream. The memory was bright, alive, yet cut with a deep, jagged edge. The day she vanished. The hours of searching, the fear, the guilt that had rooted itself in his chest and never loosened. Thomas? The voice brought him back, soft and trembling. The child's gaze held him, unwavering, as if pulling him back into the present from a life he'd buried in shadows. Do you remember? Thomas asked, unsure if he was speaking aloud or to himself. The child nodded slowly. I remember. Those words carried weight far beyond their simplicity. Thomas leaned back, heart pounding. The child seemed to know things he had kept hidden from everyone. The small fears he had whispered only to himself, the moments of hope and despair he had locked away. Every detail of his life, the ones he had thought lost or forgotten, hung in the air between them. Thomas shook his head, disbelief and hope warring within him. How could you know? The child's eyes flickered, calm but deep, as if carrying a wisdom no one their age should possess. Because I've always been with you, they whispered. The words pierced him, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something impossibly real in their claim, yet the impossibility of it shook every logical part of his mind. He forced himself to focus on the child, on the tangible reality before him, yet the memories kept surfacing. Fragments of a life he had lost, moments of love and trauma intertwined. One memory pressed harder than the rest: the day his sister disappeared. Thomas had been 7. He remembered the sound of her laughter as she ran down the hill toward the old oak tree near the river. And then, silence. No trace, no explanation. Only guilt, heavy and unrelenting, settling in his chest like a stone. Now, decades later, a child with familiar eyes sat before him, carrying echoes of that time. His pulse quickened. Could it be her? Could it be someone connected, someone who had survived the years he thought were lost? The questions were relentless, yet he dared not speak them aloud. Thomas leaned forward, his voice shaking. Tell me everything you know about me. Everything you remember. The child blinked, head tilted slightly, then spoke in a voice small but clear. You liked to read by the window. You were afraid of the dark. You used to hum when you were nervous, and sometimes you cried in the middle of the night, wishing someone would stay with you. Every word struck him like a hammer. Tears blurred his vision, not from sadness alone, but from the realization that someone, or something, had witnessed the private corners of his soul. Memories he had hidden, thoughts he had thought were unshared, were now being spoken aloud. Thomas's chest tightened. Who are you? His voice was barely audible, choked with a mixture of fear and longing. The child's gaze held his. I'm the one who never left. The room seemed to shrink around him. He could barely breathe. The fog of disbelief and hope tangled in his mind. He wanted to scream, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but the words lodged in his throat. All he could do was stare, caught between the impossible reality before him and the memories he had spent a lifetime trying to suppress. Hours passed in silence, the child sitting quietly watching him and Thomas grappling with the tide of recollections. Each one tore at him, unraveling the carefully constructed walls he had built around his past. There were moments of laughter, of family dinners, of the little victories he had shared with a sibling who no longer existed in the world as he knew it. And then the grief returned, raw and unrelenting, reminding him of the absence, the emptiness that had shaped him. Outside, the world moved on. Neighbors passed by, the city awakening, but Thomas was trapped in a private storm, one that the child had stirred with a single whispered word. He wanted to ask more, to probe the memories further, but fear gripped him. What if this was all in his mind? What if he was losing himself to longing, to wishful thinking, to grief that had never fully healed? Yet, despite the doubt, the child's presence was undeniable. Each small gesture, the way they mimicked his movements, the subtle smile when he hesitated, the quiet patience in their eyes, was proof enough that they were real. And the proof was terrifying. The sound of a knock at the door jolted him. He jumped, heart hammering, and instinctively shielded the child with his body. For a moment he considered not answering. Questions would come, explanations demanded, and he wasn't ready to reveal this impossible visitor. But then the knocking persisted, urgent now. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to move. When he opened the door, a neighbor stood there, concerned. "Thomas? Everything okay? I saw you bringing a child inside." Thomas's mind raced. How could he explain this? How could he speak the truth without sounding insane? The child remained hidden behind him, eyes wide, trembling slightly but calm. It's complicated," he said, voice low. "They just needed help." The neighbor's eyes lingered on the child, confusion written plainly across their face. Thomas felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down, a reminder that the world outside would not understand what had happened, or what was happening now. He closed the door gently, leaning against it as the fog of tension began to recede slightly. The child remained quiet, watching him with those knowing eyes. Thomas realized that the questions, the scrutiny, the impossible connection, they were all part of a journey he could not escape. He sank back into the chair, exhausted, mind swirling with memories and emotions. The child's presence had unearthed grief, guilt, and longing he had tried to bury. Yet, with it there was also a spark, a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could confront the past, find answers, and heal. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirrings of purpose. The past was no longer a cage. It was a path, winding and treacherous, but one that might lead him to understanding, to reconciliation, and perhaps to redemption. And as the child sat quietly, wrapped in the blanket, Thomas realized that the journey into the secrets of the past had only just begun. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, pale and hesitant, as Thomas sat at his small kitchen table, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with a shaking finger. The child was still asleep on the couch, the blanket pulled tight around their shoulders, soft breaths rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. Thomas's mind, however, refused to rest. He had spent the night replaying every detail, the whispered words, the knowing eyes, the uncanny understanding of his life the child had displayed. He could not ignore it. The child was connected to him, somehow, and every moment of denial, every rational explanation he tried to hold on to, collapsed under the weight of possibility. The answers he needed lay beyond the walls of this apartment. Somewhere in the city, in the shadows of his past, were clues that would reveal who this child really was. Thomas rose, stretching stiff shoulders and muscles worn from sleepless tension. He paced the room, glancing down at the child, sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, and felt a sharp pang of responsibility. He had no choice. He had to know the truth. By mid-morning they were walking the streets of the city together. The child's small hand gripped his own tightly, a gesture of trust that both grounded him and reminded him of the stakes. Thomas led them through familiar neighborhoods, places that triggered memories he had long tried to bury. Each street, each building was a fragment of the past, and he hoped that one of these fragments would illuminate the present. Their first stop was the old park near the edge of the river where he had spent countless afternoons as a child. Thomas had hoped for answers from familiar faces, friends he had grown up with, neighbors who might remember his family, or even fragments of long-forgotten gossip. The playground was empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. Thomas knelt beside the child, feeling the damp earth beneath his hands. "I used to come here," he said quietly. Maybe someone remembers something." The child tilted their head. "Do you want me to help?" Thomas froze. The words were almost surreal. How could a child, who had just appeared out of nowhere, offer guidance in a quest that he had been undertaking alone in his mind for years? And yet, the suggestion held a weight of truth, an implicit understanding that Thomas could not ignore. They moved on, visiting old friends and acquaintances. Each encounter brought its own tension. Some greeted him with warmth and surprise, others with cautious curiosity, questioning why a child was in his company. And with each conversation, Thomas began to sense the child's uncanny awareness. Subtle hints emerged, references to small details no one else should know. The child mentioned the games he used to play, the hiding spots he had chosen as a boy, and even the names of pets that had long since disappeared. Thomas's chest tightened with every revelation. The child was not only connected to him, They were a living archive of his life, a mirror of memories both cherished and painful. And yet, every clue seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. How could this be possible? How could a single child so young hold such intimate knowledge of his past? The tension escalated when they visited a former neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, an elderly woman who had known his family. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, and the walls were lined with photographs of faces long gone. Thomas explained, cautiously, that the child was connected to him in ways he could not yet understand. Mrs. Ellison's eyes softened, her hands trembling slightly. She gestured for them to sit, her gaze lingering on the child. "You remind me of someone," she said slowly. "Someone I haven't seen in decades. You've got their eyes, their quiet patience, that same look, the one that waits for answers it already knows it will get." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. His heart pounded. The weight of the past pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He had thought the memories were gone, sealed behind years of grief and denial, but now they were alive again, pressing forward through the child's presence. "Who?" Thomas asked, voice tight. Mrs. Ellison shook her head. "I can't say for sure. But you'll know when the time comes. That child carries something important. Something from your family. Something that can't be ignored." The words left Thomas breathless. Something important. Something tied to his past. The tension inside him coiled tighter, a mixture of dread and anticipation that made it almost impossible to think clearly. The child, sitting quietly beside him, seemed to sense the storm raging within him. Their small hand brushed his, grounding him in the moment. As they left Mrs. Ellison's house, Thomas felt the fog of uncertainty pressing down harder. Questions crowded his mind, each one louder than the last. Who had this child really been? How had they come to know him so intimately? And, most importantly, what did the child want from him? They retraced steps to the places of his childhood. The old library where he had spent countless hours reading and dreaming, the abandoned community center where he had played with friends long since gone, the edge of the river itself, where the memories of loss were sharpest. Everywhere they went, the child's presence acted as a key, unlocking doors to past moments Thomas had long avoided. At the library he paused beside the dusty shelves. The child ran a small hand over the spines of books, stopping occasionally to point or hum a faint, almost forgotten tune. It was a song Thomas's sister had once loved, one she had sung during summer evenings on the porch. The memory stabbed him, fresh and painful. "Do you remember this?" he whispered, voice breaking. The child nodded, softly. "I remember everything." The weight of that statement pressed upon Thomas. Everything. Not just fragments, not just memories, but every joy, every sorrow, every secret long buried. It was overwhelming, almost unbearable. And yet, amidst the fear, there was a spark of hope. The idea that understanding might be possible, that reconciliation with the past might finally come. But the path forward was treacherous. Every answer seemed to raise more questions. Every step closer to truth was paired with a pang of fear, a shadow of doubt that whispered, "What if it's all wrong? What if the past can't be fixed?" At the river's edge that evening, Thomas paused. The water shimmered under the fading light, a mirror to the sky above. The child stood beside him, small and still, eyes reflecting the same depth of emotion Thomas felt within himself. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Thomas admitted, voice tight with vulnerability. "I don't even know if it exists." The child looked up at him with quiet certainty. "It's here," they said. "You just have to find it." Thomas swallowed, the tension in his chest coiling tighter, then slowly loosening as he realized the truth in the child's words. The journey was not just about discovering the child's origins. It was about confronting his own past, facing the mistakes, the grief, the loss he had carried silently for decades. The path to truth was also the path to redemption. As the fog thickened along the riverbank, Thomas felt a mix of fear and anticipation. Every step he had taken, every encounter, every revelation had led him to this moment. And yet, the real journey was only beginning. The child's presence was a guide, a living thread connecting him to what he had lost, to what he had forgotten, and to what he might still reclaim. He reached down, taking the child's hand once more. "Then we'll find it," he said, voice firm with newfound resolve. "Together." The child squeezed his hand, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt a measure of peace, not certainty but a direction. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and challenges, but he would face it. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would finally uncover the truth hidden in the shadows of his past. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the river, Thomas and the child walked side by side into the evening mist, stepping onto a path that promised revelation, confrontation, and, maybe, healing. The air was thick with fog along the river that evening, the same river where Thomas had first found the child. The sun had long dipped behind the horizon, leaving only a pale, cold light that reflected off the rippling water. Thomas's chest was heavy with anticipation and dread. Every step toward the old oak tree, now skeletal and bare against the winter sky, felt like walking deeper into the unknown. The child walked beside him, hand in hand, silent and small, a beacon of both hope and mystery. Thomas stopped at the base of the tree. He had been here as a boy, the memory of laughter and warmth clashing violently with the ghosts of grief that had haunted him for decades. And now, standing in the same place, he felt that past and present were colliding, demanding answers he was both terrified and desperate to face. "Here," he said softly, kneeling to the child's level. "This is where it all began, or where it ended. I don't know anymore." The child looked up at him, eyes steady and filled with a strange, unearthly understanding. "It didn't end," the child said. "Not really. Not for you." Thomas swallowed hard. The words pierced him. Every memory of loss, every pang of guilt, every sleepless night returned in a rush. He thought of his sister, her laughter, her small hands slipping from his grasp, the cold emptiness that followed. The ache of unresolved grief had been a constant companion, shaping the man he had become. And now, after all these years, the child before him, this impossible, miraculous presence, was tied to that pain, to that loss. "Then, who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. The question hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to break at any moment. The child's lips quivered, but the voice that came out was calm, sure, and heavy with meaning. "I'm her." Thomas froze. His heart stuttered in disbelief. What do you mean?" His knees buckled slightly and he sank to the ground, overwhelmed by shock and a flood of memories. The child, or rather his sister, smiled faintly. "I never really left, Thomas. Not in the ways that matter." Tears sprang to his eyes, hot and uncontrolled. He reached out instinctively, his hands shaking as he touched the child's face. The warmth of skin, the fragile pulse of life against his fingers, it was impossible, miraculous, and terrifying all at once. How is this possible?" he whispered. The child's eyes glimmered. "I was taken, but I remembered you. Every day, every moment. I never forgot. And now I'm here so we can fix things." Thomas's chest heaved. Years of unanswered questions, years of guilt, years of silent suffering, all pressed into this one moment. He could feel the weight of the past breaking, but also the fragile hope of reconciliation threading through his heart. "I thought I failed you," he said, voice cracking. "I thought I lost you forever." The child's small hand reached up, brushing against his cheek. "You didn't fail me, Thomas. You held me in your heart even when you thought you hadn't. That was enough to bring me back." The words, simple yet profound, broke something open inside him. Thomas collapsed forward, holding the child close, sobs shaking his body. The years of grief, guilt, and longing poured out in a torrent of emotion, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to release the pain that had defined him. The fog swirled around them, thick and enveloping, as if the world itself were holding its breath, witnessing a reunion that defied time, logic, and expectation. The river flowed silently, carrying away the remnants of sorrow while reflecting the tender, miraculous light of understanding and love. You're really here," Thomas whispered, holding the child tightly. I can't believe it." The child nodded, eyes brimming with tears. "I promised you, remember? I would find my way back. And I did." For a long moment, they remained locked in an embrace, the weight of decades pressing down, then slowly lifting, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. Thomas's mind raced, trying to process the impossible reality. Questions demanded answers. Where had the child been all these years? How had they survived? Why had the universe allowed this reunion now? But the child's presence was grounding. They didn't answer every question, perhaps not yet, but the bond between them, forged in shared memories and unspoken understanding, was undeniable. Thomas realized then that some truths could not be explained fully, but could only be felt, lived, and embraced. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into the child's eyes. I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice choked with emotion. "You've returned something I thought was gone forever." The child's lips curved into a small smile. "We found each other. That's all the thanks we need." The reunion, however miraculous, was not without its trials. Thomas knew the world outside this fog-shrouded riverbank would demand explanations, that practicalities and human logic might challenge this miracle. But at that moment none of it mattered. The past had collided with the present, and the impossible had become real. As they sat beneath the oak tree, Thomas began to speak of the years they had lost, the moments he had mourned, the silent nights of grief, the emptiness that had shaped him. The child listened, offering no judgment, only understanding. In return, the child began to speak of their own journey, of the ways they had survived, and of the memories they had carried in secret. Each word, each detail, threaded a fragile bridge across the chasm of years. Thomas felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that his sister, or the child, was alive, present, and whole. Sorrow for the decades they had lost, the pain endured in absence, the years of uncertainty and fear. Yet, the sorrow was tempered by gratitude, the kind that makes the soul ache even as it soars. "Thomas," the child said after a long pause, voice quiet but firm, "we can't change the past. But we can be here now. Together. We can make the time we have matter." The words struck him with the force of revelation. It was not merely about reunion, it was about redemption, forgiveness, and the opportunity to heal the wounds that had haunted them both. Thomas nodded slowly, tears streaking his face. "Together," he repeated. For a moment the world seemed to hold still. The fog, the river, the skeletal oak tree, all of it faded into a tapestry of light and emotion. Thomas realized that the journey he had embarked upon, the quest to understand the child, had led him here, to a place where grief and love could coexist, where loss could transform into hope, and where the impossible had become possible. But the revelation also carried a subtle tension, a reminder that the world outside this riverbank would not fully understand. Questions about survival, identity, and explanation remained unanswered. Thomas knew that challenges awaited beyond this moment of intimacy and reunion. Yet for now they could rest in the knowledge of connection, of truth, and of the fragile miracle of presence. As night fell and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Thomas held the child close once more. The river whispered beside them, carrying the weight of decades and the promise of renewal. The world was uncertain, chaotic, and demanding, but they had found each other. That was enough. In that quiet, miraculous moment, Thomas allowed himself to hope, to love, to forgive, and, most importantly, to believe that some truths, though hidden for years, would always find their way back into the light. The child nestled against his chest, small but unwavering, and Thomas whispered a promise he had carried in silence for too long. "I will never let you go again. Never. Not now, not ever." The river flowed, indifferent yet eternal, reflecting the bond between the two of them, a bond forged by loss, strengthened by time, and sealed by the miraculous truth they now shared. For the first time in decades Thomas felt whole. And though the journey was far from over, the hardest step had been taken. The moment of revelation, of truth, of emotional culmination, had arrived. And beneath the skeletal branches of the oak tree, standing in the foggy silence that had first brought them together, Thomas understood at last. The past could not destroy them, the mystery could not frighten them, and love would always find a way. The morning sun broke through the fog in thin, golden slivers, brushing the river with warmth that had been absent for decades. Thomas stood on the bank, the child at his side, hand in hand. The water shimmered faintly, carrying with it reflections of the past, present, and perhaps, the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. It had been weeks since the revelation, weeks since the impossible reunion with the child who had been, somehow, his sister. And yet, every day since had been a journey, of discovery, reconciliation, and the slow mending of wounds that had shaped his life in silence. Thomas had begun to forgive himself. Each step along the river reminded him of mistakes, lost opportunities, and years of grief he had carried alone. And yet, as he watched the child skip ahead along the muddy bank, laughing softly at something he couldn't see, he realized that guilt no longer needed to define him. The past was a shadow, yes, but it no longer controlled the present. He paused, taking a deep breath. The scent of wet earth and river water filled his lungs, grounding him. He remembered the first time he had found the child here, shivering and drenched, and how helpless he had felt, overwhelmed by the impossibility of the moment. Now he felt strength born from love, understanding, and the resilience of the human spirit. Inside his apartment, the process of rebuilding had begun. He had contacted family members, tentatively at first, explaining the truth in small pieces. The reactions had been varied: shock, disbelief, tears, and finally, acceptance. Slowly, bridges that had been burned, weakened, or abandoned for decades were being mended. The child, once a symbol of mystery and grief, was now a catalyst for reconciliation. Thomas had learned to communicate openly, to speak of loss without shame, and to express gratitude for the presence of someone he had thought gone forever. The child had become not only a companion but a teacher, guiding him through the delicate process of healing. In their quiet moments, they shared laughter, memories, and small routines that brought a semblance of normalcy to lives that had long been fractured. One afternoon, Thomas took the child to the park where he had played as a boy, a place that had once been filled with joy and shadows alike. As they walked among the bare trees and empty swings, he spoke gently. "I never realized how much I needed you," he said, voice soft but steady. "Not just to heal, but to remember what love really feels like." The child smiled, small and knowing. "Love doesn't disappear, Thomas. It waits. Sometimes it waits a very long time." The words settled over him like a balm. He understood now that his journey was not simply about reunion, it was about transformation. About taking the pain of the past, the grief and the mistakes, and forging something new. He had always been haunted by absence, by the things he could not change. Now he was learning that presence, however fragile and miraculous, could redefine everything. Evenings were spent near the river, where the fog and water had once been symbols of uncertainty. Now they were symbols of renewal. Thomas and the child would sit together, watching the current flow, discussing memories of the past and dreams for the future. The river became a living metaphor, teaching them both that life moves forward, even when it seems frozen, and that loss can give way to hope. He began to reconnect with old friends, people who had been a part of his life but had drifted away over the years. The child, with their quiet awareness and gentle presence, smoothed the awkwardness of reunion, allowing Thomas to approach relationships he had once abandoned with openness and humility. Each reconnection was small, incremental, yet profoundly meaningful. It was as if the presence of the child had repaired not just his heart, but the network of connections that made life whole. Thomas also began to confront his own sense of guilt more directly. He visited places tied to past mistakes, old neighborhoods, childhood haunts, and even the abandoned home where he had once lived with his sister. With each visit, he spoke aloud, admitting to himself the things he had carried silently for decades. And in return, he felt a weight lift, a sense of forgiveness washing over him like gentle waves along the riverbank. One evening, standing beneath the oak tree where the child had first revealed their identity, Thomas spoke softly. "I cannot change what happened," he said, voice breaking, "but I can honor it. I can honor you and the life you have returned to me." The child reached up, resting a small hand against his cheek. "You already have," they said. "Every day since I came back, you've honored it. You've honored us." Tears blurred his vision, a mixture of grief, joy, and relief coiling in his chest. He realized then that redemption was not a single moment, but a continuous journey, a commitment to love, to remember, and to act with compassion. The presence of the child had illuminated the path, showing him that while the past could not be changed, the future was theirs to shape together. As days turned into weeks, Thomas began small rituals that symbolized his transformation. They planted flowers along the riverbank, tended to the neglected corners of the apartment, and revisited places that had once been painful. Each act was a reclamation of life, a conscious effort to infuse joy, hope, and presence into spaces that had long been defined by absence. Neighbors who had once eyed Thomas with curiosity now observed him with quiet admiration. He was no longer the solitary figure haunted by grief. He had become a man renewed by connection, guided by love, and tempered by the lessons of loss. And at the center of this transformation was the child. No longer a mystery but a living testament to the possibility of healing and the power of human connection. One crisp morning, Thomas brought the child to the edge of the river, the water moving slowly, reflecting the sky in shades of gold and gray. They sat together, feet dangling just above the water, and watched as the current carried leaves, twigs, and small debris downstream. "See," Thomas said softly, "life keeps moving. No matter what happens, it moves forward." The child nodded, eyes wide and thoughtful. "And we move with it. Even if we are scared, even if we have lost things before." Thomas smiled, a warmth he had not felt in years spreading through his chest. He felt present, grounded, and at peace for the first time in decades. The past had been acknowledged, the grief honored, and the love rediscovered. Redemption was not a destination. It was the act of living fully, openly, and with compassion. They remained there for a long while, the river whispering beside them, the wind carrying soft echoes of the past. Thomas understood that the journey of healing was continuous, that the presence of the child would always challenge and inspire him. But now he faced it willingly, with an open heart and a renewed spirit. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the riverbank, Thomas took a deep breath. He realized that the transformation he had undergone was profound, not just in the reunion with the child but in himself. He had learned to forgive, to love, to confront fear, and to embrace hope. He looked down at the child, their small hand entwined with his, and whispered, "Thank you. For everything. For coming back, for trusting me, for letting me be here with you." The child smiled faintly, leaning against him. "Thank you for keeping the promise, Thomas. For never giving up on us." The river flowed silently beside them, eternal and unyielding, carrying with it the lessons of life, loss, and renewal. And beneath its shifting surface, Thomas felt a mirror of his own journey, a journey of grief transformed into hope, of absence transformed into presence, of loss transformed into love. In that quiet, suspended moment, Thomas understood the full measure of his transformation. He was no longer the man haunted by the past. He was a man renewed, redeemed, and ready to live fully in the light of connection, compassion, and love. And as the child's small hand squeezed his, a silent promise passing between them, Thomas knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, grounded in trust, strengthened by love, and guided by the enduring lessons of the river that had once reflected only fog and uncertainty, but now reflected clarity, hope, and renewal. The river lay calm under the fading light of evening, its surface reflecting the soft pinks and golds of the setting sun. Thomas and the child sat side by side on the bank, their feet brushing the shallow water. Silence had settled between them, comfortable and warm, a contrast to the storm of emotions that had carried them here. The journey had been long, filled with grief, revelation, and the painstaking steps of healing. And yet, the river whispered that life always carries on, quietly, beneath even the most extraordinary events. Thomas watched the child play with a drifting leaf, letting it float downstream. He marveled at the fragile, miraculous presence that had entered his life, at the way it had reopened old wounds yet healed them at the same time. He had learned to forgive himself, to embrace love without fear, and to find peace in the knowledge that some losses could be softened by unexpected miracles. And yet, even in this moment of quiet contentment, a faint unease lingered, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. The child sometimes seemed to disappear for mere seconds at a time, just out of the corner of his eye. He would turn and the child would be there, smiling as if nothing had happened. Thomas had learned not to question it. Some mysteries were meant to remain unanswered. Some truths were more felt than explained. "Do you ever remember before?" he asked softly, breaking the silence. The child looked up at him, eyes thoughtful, as if weighing what could and could not be shared. "Sometimes," they said quietly, "but it's like looking through fog. I remember feeling lost but not exactly how or why. What matters is now." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that the past, while present in memory, was no longer a cage. The child's words were a reminder that some things, pain, loss, and even miracles, did not need full explanation to be real. They only needed acknowledgement, presence, and the courage to keep moving forward. The river shifted gently, carrying with it the echoes of time, memory, and life's quiet continuity. Thomas realized that the mystery of the child, their origins, and the incredible timing of their return were part of a greater rhythm he might never fully comprehend. And that was okay. Some questions were not meant to be answered. Some wonders existed simply to remind us of the depth and complexity of love, loss, and connection. He reached out, brushing wet hair from the child's forehead. I finally understand," he said softly. "Life isn't just about what we lose. It's about how we respond, what we cherish, and who we choose to love along the way." The child smiled faintly, small but bright. "And you chose well, Thomas. Always." As the sun sank lower, the fog began to drift in again, curling around the riverbank in pale tendrils. Thomas shivered slightly, not from cold but from the sense of something eternal, something larger than himself, pressing gently against the edges of perception. He realized that the child's presence was both a miracle and a mystery, a bridge between past and present, grief and hope, loss and love. Thomas rose, holding the child's hand. Together they walked along the bank, letting the current guide their steps. And as they moved, Thomas noticed a fleeting shimmer across the water, a glint of light, a reflection perhaps, or something else entirely. He blinked and it was gone. The child's hand squeezed as tightly, grounding him, reminding him that the present mattered more than the fleeting uncertainty around them. Life, Thomas understood, was full of questions without answers, shadows without explanations, and moments of inexplicable grace. He could no longer cling to certainty, nor did he want to. He had learned to embrace the unknown, to live fully in the moments that truly mattered, and to trust the bonds of love that had returned to him against all odds. The river whispered behind them as they moved toward home, its waters carrying the faintest traces of the past, the weight of the present, and the infinite possibility of the future. Thomas glanced down at the child, their small face serene and knowing, and felt a deep, abiding gratitude. Some mysteries would remain. Some questions would never have answers. And yet, in that ambiguity, Thomas found peace, understanding, and a profound sense of connection. The past was no longer a burden, the future no longer a fear. Life was unfolding moment by moment with all its wonder, heartbreak, and joy. As night fell and the first stars appeared above, Thomas whispered to the child, "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." The child squeezed his hand, and for a moment, everything was perfect, silent, fragile, and infinitely beautiful. The river flowed beside them, eternal, mysterious, and forgiving. And Thomas understood finally that the heart could carry both grief and hope, loss and love in equal measure, and that some miracles, though fleeting or unexplained, were enough to change everything. The fog lingered, curling around the edges of the world, a quiet reminder that some mysteries are meant to endure. But Thomas no longer feared them. He had found love, redemption, and the courage to live fully. And in the child's eyes, reflected in the soft river light, he saw the promise of all that was still to come.